Hey guys, welcome back for today's lecture on Thursday, April 23rd. We have a Zoom meeting today at 11. I want everybody that can be there to be there. I've noticed that we've had more and more students are kind of falling off on the keeping up with the essential questions. So I want everybody there. I realize that in saying that, um, the reason they're not answering the essential questions because they're not watching the lectures. So obviously saying that in the lecture is only going to get the message across to the kids that are already doing their work. So those of you that are doing the work, I appreciate it. Your effort does not go unnoticed, nor does it go unappreciated. That goes a long way. And continue the good work. Um, these are just enforcing good habits and good work ethic. And I appreciate you guys being able to adapt and work hard under the circumstances. So yesterday we talked about Korea. We talked about Vietnam and China. Now we're going to get into some of the heat or the buildup to the heat of the Cold War. In 1953, I believe, Joseph Stalin, Premier Joseph Stalin, head of the Soviet Union, dies of a stroke. And he'd been in power for basically the entire time the Soviet Union has existed. He'd been in power for, I'm going to ballpark, at least 30 years. So, and in his time, he had been very oppressive. He had been very manipulative. And he developed this cult of a personality, basically forcing people to like him or at least uh, fear him or respect him out of fear. And Khrushchev was like his right hand man, and him and Nikita Khrushchev are very close. And then he dies, and Nikita Khrushchev becomes the next leader of the Soviet Union. Um, and everyone's surprised 3 years into it, Khrushchev gives a speech in the uh, what do they call it? Basically, in the Soviet version of our Congress, he gives a speech to governors and cronies of the Communist Party, and it's known as a secret speech because it wasn't open to the public and it wasn't open to the media. But word gets around fast in this case. And in it, he denounces the policies of Stalin. He goes back and he's the first person to openly speak against Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, or at least the first one that doesn't immediately get sent to the gulags, which the gulags were a political prison in the middle of nowhere in Russia, like in Siberia. And in front of all these other these other, basically in a room full of people that had supported Stalin their whole political lives, because if they hadn't supported Stalin, they would be dead for sure. But in a room full of these people, he goes on to talk about some of the bad things that Stalin did and talk about the purges that Stalin ordered. I mean, Stalin ordered the execution of millions of Soviet people. And Khrushchev's the first one to talk about it bluntly. Now, it's ironic because he took part in the purges. You know, he had enemies executed under Stalin. He was not above it. But he talks about it, and some of the people in that meeting room, some of them applauded, some of them were amazed and supportive, and then others were shocked. Actually, I'm sure everybody was shocked to a certain extent, and some were downright furious. People that were really, really, attached to Stalin, they couldn't believe it. They thought this was terrible. One Soviet territory, which is the modern country of Georgia, and yes, there is a country called Georgia. It's a small country southeast of like Turkey, kind of in a similar area to Russia. Georgia was the country where actually Stalin was from. So, despite all the oppression, Georgia was very proud of Joseph Stalin, and Georgia was a Soviet Union territory. So, Georgia had riots when this speech got out to the public. Like they hated Khrushchev. This whole speech leads to a period that was known as de-Stalinization. Now, it doesn't happen immediately. Like Stalin still sticks around in like Soviet mines and Soviet buildings, but eventually, a couple years later, de-Stalinization takes effect. And de-Stalinization is just Soviet distancing from the Stalin era. So one of the things they did was they renamed Stalingrad. They're like, all right, well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to take away his namesake. They renamed Stalingrad to Volgograd, I believe is what it is now. And they removed some pictures of him in the, government buildings, and they just try and distance themselves from Stalin. They see it, or at least Khrushchev saw it as kind of a shameful time in their history. Now, Khrushchev starts to turn away from the original ideas that the Soviet Union is founded on Lenin, Leninist ideas. Those are the ideas of Vladimir Lenin, like the true Marxist ideas of communism. And because of this, he damages the relationship between the Soviet Union and China, because Mao Zedong was very, very a very big follower of Lenin ideas and Marxist ideas. And so that's where China and Soviets falling out comes from. Because remember, the idea of communism is it has to require a violent takeover. There has to be war. It's inevitable. That's what Lenin always said. And Khrushchev says that war doesn't have to be the cause for communism. He calls for a doctrine of peaceful coexistence between communism and capitalism. And at first, America's like, oh, this is nice. This guy can possibly, we could possibly be allies with this guy. We could possibly manipulate him. Maybe he's soft. And that leads to what was known as the 1959 kitchen debate. It was a debate where Vice President at the time, Richard Nixon, he's Vice President in 1959 to Dwight Eisenhower, he flies to the Soviet Union to have a televised friendly debate with Khrushchev. And it's called the kitchen debate because for some reason the set that it was on was in the style of an American style kitchen. I don't really know the story behind that, but that's the setting where they debated. And the whole debate's really purely on American capitalism versus Soviet communism. And both men look good. Like they both know what they're talking about. They make good points, and they shake each other's hands, and they're on their way. Now, no one like comes out of this a winner. It's not like Nixon convinced Khrushchev to go capitalist and vice versa. You know, Khrushchev doesn't convince Nixon to go back home and pitch some communist ideas to Eisenhower. But they both said their piece and they both explained what they believed their reasoning was. Khrushchev, what I find interesting, he talks about how America has built itself into this great power and this admirable country, and it took America about 200 years, which was right pretty close, right? So 1776, 1959, so a little under 200 years, but so it took you guys 200 years under your current capitalist system. Soviet Union has been in existence for about 40 years. And we are on par with you guys now, if not surpassed. So what's that say about our system versus yours? Which at the time you had to really consider, like, wow, that's a pretty good point. Soviet Union has risen quickly. But how much of that was actual economic power and not just extreme dedication by the civilians of the Soviet Union or forced adaptation? Because the power and the height of the Soviet Union, it's not going to last for 180 years like the American capitalist system had at that point. But continuing on the strength of the Soviet Union, they decided to launch a satellite into space. First satellite ever launched into space was Sputnik on October 4th. It is just a kind of saucer with radio antenna attached to it. Sent into space, it's sent off, I think it was going like 18,000 miles per hour. So it actually reaches Earth's orbit in an hour, a little over an hour and a half, which is very fast for something to reach that distance. And this, of course, makes the news all over the Soviet Union and then the rest of the world. And the Soviet Union thinks it's awesome. They're celebrating. They're like, man, this is sweet. Look at all this technology we have. Look at how fast we're growing and what this means and what we can do. And in America, it scares the holy heck out of us. People didn't, like, at the time, they didn't know what this technology was. People thought Sputnik was watching them in their living room. They thought it was like a camera. Like, it was said in the newspapers one night that, oh, you could see Sputnik traveling through the sky, which is not true. It's a tiny, like, it's the size of a dinner plate, and there's no way you're going to see it from space. But the newspapers would say you could see it through the sky, and they'd be looking at, stars or whatever could possibly be up in infinite space, and they'd think, oh my gosh, they're surveying us. They can see us. Soviets can see everything. They're spying on us. We're so in trouble, which is not true, but it terrified us. And so America responds by launching the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA. We decided we've got to counter it. We've got to do something to catch up. And this launches, no pun intended, the space race. Space was a completely foreign idea to us, to everybody. Like, we had no idea. We knew we weren't alone, or we knew Earth wasn't the only object in the universe, but we never thought, like, I wonder what else is out there. I wonder how we could find out. For all we knew at that time, there we could find new resources. What if we found a planet that was just filled with natural gas or with coal or whatever resources, non-renewable resources that we needed on Earth? What if we found that? Boy, how powerful could we be then if we just found an entire new resource reserve? Stuff like that. What could we do? The possibilities we envisioned were endless. And dadgummit, the Soviets got there first, and that just terrified us. We hated that. Now we're going to get into Fidel Castro. Cuba had been conflicted. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, Cuba becomes independent, and so, okay, getting a little off on a tangent. Spanish-American War, the U.S. fought Spain for its colonies, basically. And we help Cuba gain its independence from Spain because Cuba was previously a Spanish colony. We help Cuba, we win, and then we say, okay, you guys want to be an American territory now? And they're like, no, we want to be independent. Like, this was for our independence. And so we continuously kind of bugged them and tried getting, oh, come on, be a territory, be an American colony. And they're like, no, we want to be independent. And they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it leads to a lot of tension. The government of Cuba in the 50s was led by a man named Fulgencio Batista, who was, sympathetic to America. Like, he had a good relationship with the American government. He was not super popular in Cuba. He was kind of oppressive. He was not a popular guy. And Cuba economically was being basically taken advantage of by the U.S. Cuba's greatest export to this day is sugar, and America had a very, very, very good trade deal with Cuba. Basically, we took all their sugar, gave them pennies for it, and bullied them into that. And so Cuba's in a rough spot, as you have to be to turn to communism, and he leads a communist revolution. And he overthrows Batista, and Castro is named dictator of Cuba, and he nationalizes the sugar industry, meaning that all sugar farms or plantations, whatever they were, they are now owned and operated by the Cuban government, which means the Cuban government has full control over where it's sold to. And in this case, they decided to stop trading or selling their sugar to America and started selling it to the Soviet Union. And they develop a strong relationship with their fellow communists. And America's furious. They were furious. They had access to that land or to that industry. And now they don't. They get none of it. Now, Cuba also had an American naval base. Guantanamo Bay was an American naval base in Cuba. And Castro, all right, well, I'm going to seize control of that. I'm going to seize control of every American company and business that is in Cuba. So basically, he kicks any kind of American power out of Cuba. And Castro's in power for, over 50 years. He just died, I don't know, less than 10 years ago. He had, I don't know how many assassination attempts on his life orchestrated by the American government. Like, we sent the CIA in to kill him, and it didn't work. So he was tough, but he was oppressive. You ask Cubans today for their opinion on Fidel Castro, Cubans that are in America, uh, and they will tell you just how horrible he was. He would give speeches like in the middle of like Havana Town Square, and he would order every Cuban citizen in that city to come out and listen to him. And he would speak for 12 hours about nothing, just rambling, talking about how awesome he is. And if you got tired and sat down, you were arrested. If you weren't all in to Cuban communism, you were arrested. So, kind of a sidebar here, being a K-State grad, a couple years ago, K-State had their head basketball coach. His name was Frank Martin. He's since moved on to the University of South Carolina. Frank Martin is the son of Cuban immigrants. So Frank was born in Miami. He's never been to Cuba, but his parents escaped Cuba. Cuba's 90 miles from the tip of Florida. A lot of times people will just like board rafts and ride the waves into Florida. Frank Martin's parents came from Cuba, and his parents and grandparents would tell him stories about it. And he told on the day that Fidel Castro died, which, man, that would have to be no more than 7 or 8 years ago. And he was asked about his opinion of Fidel Castro after his death. And Frank Martin tells a story about Castro's oppression, and he talks about something called the Mariel boat lift. And you can look it up. The Mariel boat lift was a deal in, I think, the 70s and 80s that if you were a Cuban immigrant living in the United States and you had family back in Cuba that you wanted to bring over, you could notify the American, or you could notify the Cuban government, and they would pay. If you paid a lot of money, then they would ship your relatives to Miami to be with you. So you'd pay all this money. And at the time, Castro had arrested so many people that their prisons were overflowing. Way too many prisoners to keep. So he had to get rid of them somehow, and he wasn't about to let them back out on the streets. I mean these political prisoners, like people that just disagreed with him. So he had to do something. So he used this as an opportunity. If you were in Miami and you paid for your grandma and grandpa to get on a boat and come to Miami, then they would take your money, and then on a boat, they would tell you, all right, be at Miami Beach tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., and your grandma and grandpa will be there. You show up at the beach at 8 a.m., a boat comes in, and your grandma and grandpa are not on that boat. But what is on that boat are 10 of the worst criminals from Cuba you could find. Castro wasn't putting his political opponents on those ships. He was putting out the worst prisoners he could find, murderers, people with very violent backgrounds, and he's putting them on this boat, and he is shipping them to the U.S. Not his problem anymore. And you were not getting whatever relative you were paying to see. Yeah, it was a pretty horrible deal. But honestly, smart on his part. That's pretty creative. And that's why the 70s and 80s, Miami, Florida was filled with crime from Cuban immigrants. Think of Scarface, if you've ever seen or heard of that movie. That's a result of the Mariel boat lift and of Castro's communism. So today's essential question: how does the U.S. respond to launching Sputnik? I'm looking for. You could get real elaborate. The answer I'm looking for is real simple. They created something. That's it. That's all I'm looking for. Nothing terribly in depth. So that'll do it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Zoom today at 11. We'll get that taken care of. And just have a nice little chit chat, catch up, and then take care of some of the important stuff that I want to get through. So, all right, guys. Hey, have a terrific day.